Thank you. So welcome, bonjour tout le monde. Thank you very much for joining us. My name is Jackie Gahagan. I'm the Associate Vice President Research here at Mount St. Vincent University, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to our Black and Indigenous Speakers Series. And for those of you who are new to this series, I just wanted to remind you that the purpose of this series is essentially to initiate important conversations by inviting Black and Indigenous scholars to share their knowledge, their worldviews, and their contributions to their respective academic fields. In addition, we also here in the research office at Mount St. Vincent University very much welcome your suggestions for future speakers for our 2024-2025 series. You can send those suggestions to Liz here in the research office, and we'd appreciate your thoughtful suggestions and certainly happy to entertain those. So I just wanted to provide a land acknowledgement before we turn it over to my dear colleague and friend, Dr. Barb Hamilton-Hinch. So just to note that Mount St. Vincent University acknowledges our location in Mi'kma'ki, which is the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. This territory is covered by the Treaties of Peace and Friendship, which Mi'kmaq and Maliseet people first signed with the British Crown in 1725. These treaties did not deal with the surrender of lands and resources, but in fact recognized Mi'kmaq and Maliseet title and established the rules for what was to become an ongoing relationship between nations. Mount St. Vincent University acknowledges with deep respect the long history of cultural traditions of the Mi'kmaq. We're committed to maintaining and building relationships based on the principles of mutual trust, respect, reciprocity, and collaboration in the spirit of reconciliation. And we would also like to acknowledge the longstanding contributions of African Nova Scotian peoples here in the province of Nova Scotia. So thank you, and I'll stop there and turn it over to you, Liz. Thank you.
Thank you, Jackie. So I'm now going to ask Uchenna Opera to introduce Dr. Barb Hamilton-Hinch for us today. Uchenna is a second-year student completing her final semester in the Masters of Public Relations program at the Mount, and she is also the Communications and Social Media Manager with our Black Student Support Office. So over to you, Uchenna. You're muted.
So sorry. Thank you so much, Liz. I would just go ahead to introduce our guest speaker for today. Dr. Barb Hamilton-Hinch is the Assistant Vice Provost of Equity and Inclusion and an Assistant Professor in the School of Health and Human Performance at Dalhousie University, teaching in the Recreation and Leisure Studies Division, as well as the Health Promotion Division. Her work examines the impact of structural, systemic, and institutional racism on diverse population, particularly people of African descent. So Barb, thank you so much for joining us, and we're excited to hear you talk on the topic leading from a race-conscious lens. Thank you so much. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you for that warm introduction. And I'm always fascinated where people find, those bios. And if I sent it in, I appreciate that. But I sometimes forget to put associate professor, and that's irrelevant. But just in terms of, I recognize when I hear my bios mistakes that I should have corrected. So thank you for that and making me aware that I do need to go in and edit wherever that may be. Thank you for the land acknowledgement, and thank you for this invitation. And I am very excited to be here today and thank Mount St. Vincent University for considering me to come and speak on this important topic, leading from a race-conscious lens. And whenever I speak, I do have to acknowledge my ancestors, and I will do that in my presentation more formally on whose shoulders I stand. And if it wasn't for them, I would not be here today. So in my talking and sharing, I often leave a little bit of myself within my presentations, which is very important, being one of the few African Nova Scotian colleagues at this institution and at many of our Atlantic universities. So I start this presentation today, or this talk today, because I'm looking forward to us having some great conversation at the end. Between me and the other world, there's ever an unasked question, unasked by some through feelings of delicacy, by others through the difficulty of rightly framing it all, nonetheless flutter around it. They approach me in a half-hesitant sort of way, eye me curiously or compassionately, and then instead of saying directly, how does it feel to be a problem? They say, I know an excellent colored man in my town, or I fought on the Mackenzaville Or do not these Southern outrages make your blood boil? At these I smile, or am interested, or reduce the boiling to a simmer, as the occasion may require. To the real question, how does it feel to be a problem? I answer, seldom a word. And that's by W.E.B. Du Bois. And the reason why today I think it's fitting to talk about this quote and to use this to introduce our talk today on leading from a race-conscious lens is because that is the reality of so many of us that are racially visible or identify as a person of African descent. And so as I talk today, you'll hear me use the term African Nova Scotian, Black, racialized, but you could easily put within that sentence any other population that has experienced marginalization in different ways. But today I want to talk about leading from a race-conscious lens, because some of us are comfortable in talking about race. Some of us are comfortable in acknowledging how someone identifies, and some of us still avoid talking about a race. And so today I'm going to bring some examples, both from my research, from my working experiences, and both as a student. So I'm hoping that I'll tackle a little bit of everyone who's here with us this afternoon. So leading from a race-conscious lens. This here quote that I love to often have is from my PhD. My PhD looked at the impact of racism on the health and well-being of women of African descent living in Nova Scotia. And I draw on that research because of the fact that many of these women talked about their experience of dealing with racism as Black women. And this quote is from one of my participants called Ava. We have to reestablish ourselves. It goes back to a knowing, and I think a firm foundation again. And if we understand who we are, then what they say, will it really matter? So the reason why this research is relevant to what we're talking about today, some of these women came from predominantly Black continents or countries, such as the Caribbean or countries in the continent of Africa, to Nova Scotia, to Canada. From their experience of living in their country of origin or their island of origin, they didn't really experience this thing called racism in the same way that many of us who've lived here for many years, who've been here for a long time, experienced. They talked about how they could move freely in their stores, in their education system, in their justice system, how they didn't have to question how people saw them, how people considered them, how people treated them, and was it because of the color of their skin? When they came to Nova Scotia, in the case of this PhD, they became more aware of the color of their skin. Some of the women talked about how they used to enjoy going shopping in their hometown, in their home country. And something as enjoyable as shopping was no longer something they enjoyed. They were followed. These were women who were professionals. They were nurses, educators, professors, teachers, politicians, judges. And this was their lived reality of moving about in a race-conscious society, but one in which we talk about inclusion, multiculturalism, being mosaic. If you are a person who is racialized, if you're a person of African descent, even though others may want to say that we're all the same, which is a form of racism, we are very race conscious. So my intent today is to encourage those of us who are joining us online and who watch this later to think about leading from a race conscious lens, to see all that that person is bringing into the space. And so as I talk about the shoulders I stand on, this is a picture of my parents, Norman Arthur David Hamilton, and my grandparents, James Bundy, Rosella Bundy, Eula Johnson Hamilton, and Reginald Hamilton. And the reason why I celebrate the shoulders I stand on is because during the time of my parents and my grandparents' lives, they had no choice but to live in a very race-conscious society. They were denied equitable education. My dad had less than a grade 6 education. My mother made it to junior high. And it wasn't because they weren't smart. It's because there was not education opportunities for them to continue. They went to segregated schools that were located in their community. My grandparents, my grandfather was a laborer, both were, and my grandparents, including my mother, were domestic workers. And they worked in the home of predominantly white individuals. In my mother's case, which is very ironic, as I work in the south end of Halifax, she lived in the home of a fairly well-to-do white family in the south end of Halifax, taking care of their children, taking care of their home. She moved there in their home when she was 16 years old, and that's where she stayed. And she would tell me stories about how the children treated her, what they called her as a Black woman. And so as I began to become more educated, more informed of what it meant to be a woman of African descent, what it meant to be a Black woman, I began to become more conscious of how my skin color was determining and dictating my success or lack thereof. I grew up in predominantly Black communities in the outskirts of of Halifax. My mother's community is Cherry Brook, Lake Loon. My dad's community was Beachville. And then we are also descendants of Africville, which are the images you see here. Growing up in a Black community protected me. However, as a parent, I couldn't provide that same protection to my children. What happens to many of us who grow up in rural communities, and at the time of me growing up, these were rural communities, we move from our communities into the city for opportunities of education or employment. And as I began to progress through my career and have a family, I wanted them to have opportunities that I didn't have as a young Black woman. However, removing them from their Black communities that protected me put them in harm's way for other experiences of racism. My oldest did French immersion and was often one of 2 Black children in a classroom. That was very obvious to him, very evident to him. My youngest started in French immersion, but later switched to English. But the communities we lived in were predominantly white. The schools we went to were predominantly white. And so as children, although I didn't want them to grow up with the same lived reality of me, of thinking about how they as Black men would have to navigate this world, they did. I remember my oldest son bringing friends to our home over the holidays one year. And he shared with me, and his friends said to him, "Your home is not very white welcoming." My son didn't know what to say. I said, "Son, you are a Black man. We are a Black family. We are going to celebrate who we are as people of African descent." And so I realized then very early that I had to get my children to understand more about being race conscious and how people saw them. And again, I could share lots of this, but we don't have lots of time, and I do want us to have conversation. And so this is the family that raised me. And because I was moving into communities for education that were predominantly white, the place I felt safest when I was in my community was with my family and within my Baptist faith. So like many of us who are African Nova Scotian, faith in the African United Baptist Church is what protected us from the racism we experienced. Drawing again on the PhD and talking to the women, one of the women talked about how they went through their week as a social worker, working in predominantly white organization, being asked if they are the nurse, but often the LPN, not an RN, which is quite a difference in that situation, if they were the housekeeper, if they worked in the cafeteria. They weren't always the registered social worker who was there to take care of the person. As they lived through that week in a very race-conscious environment that saw them as that Black person, but not in a positive way, they said the only time that they were able to let go and relax and be themselves was when they went to a Black church, where the church, the congregation looked like them, the pastor looked like them, the songs celebrated who they were as Black people. So they recognized that in order for them to feel safe, to grow spiritually, emotionally, mentally, physically, to be able to live through the week at work, church played that role of celebrating who they were as a Black person. As I moved through my education, and I know you're looking at these pictures and saying, oh, look how cute she is with her afro. My mother was very good at making sure that I embraced who I was and had my beautiful afro when I was in grade 3. But throughout my education, I was often the only person of African descent. When I graduated from my PhD, and I do want to acknowledge my one of my supervising committee members, Dr. Jackie Cahagan, we were just talking earlier, who was with me for my marathon. I lived my PhD as a Black woman. I was challenged in how I was experiencing racism while I was doing my PhD. I would sometimes be questioned about am I talking enough about gender, because so much of my focus was on race, and trying to get it to be important enough for my committee to also see my research from a race-conscious lens, identifying and recognizing that, yes, I am a Black woman, but the impact of being a Black woman on my research was more impactful, and I'm not trying to compare the two, than being a woman. When I walk into a space, I talk about how my presence into that space disrupts that space because I'm a Black woman. And being in academia, being at post-secondary institutions, where you don't see many Black professors, where you don't see many Black administrators, where you don't see many Black assistant vice provosts. I know that as I moved through Dalhousie University, as I moved through the Mount, where I did graduate with my education degree, that I am disrupting those spaces as a Black woman. And if anything you leave with today is acknowledging that people who are racialized want you to be race conscious, to lead from a race conscious perspective. When we lead from a race conscious perspective in academia, then we are acknowledging the trials, tribulations, successes of the students, of the staff, of the faculty, of the participants, of whoever we are working with. As soon as you don't see that race, then you're dismissing so much of who that person is. You're dismissing sometimes their richness, their generational historical trauma, who their family is, their communities, and what they have accomplished. As I moved through my education, I always wanted to be in a position where I could influence others who didn't celebrate who they were as people of African descent, as a Black person. As I said today, I'll be sharing some personal stories. So I grew up not loving who I was as a Black person because everything around me told me that it wasn't good. TV shows, commercials, my teachers who stood in front of me who didn't reflect me. And so I remember wanting to make sure that the jobs that I took, I'd be in positions where I could see the children that were not seen, that I could celebrate the people who had struggles. And so when I went to do my BEd, my intent was not to be a classroom teacher, but to be a principal. And I wanted to be a principal because I wanted to get rid of all those teachers that didn't see who I was as a Black student. And I wanted to protect the other Black students who are now going through a public education. Unfortunately, I didn't get to do that because I had the opportunity to come back to Dalhousie and be in a position that I helped to create as a student. And I became the Black Student Advisor. So Uchenna, I celebrate your position within the Black Student Advising Center at the Mount and the importance of that plays. And so having the opportunity to be at an institution where I could work directly with students of African descent, with Black students, African Nova Scotian students, and see their brilliance and support them was fantastic. I got to be in a position where I got to be in a position where in a job that I helped to develop. But I didn't want the university to only see me as a Black student advisor. And so as I became older, I became more race conscious about how I need to also see people, help people see my brilliance as a person of African descent. So while being the Black student advisor, I also began to start a PhD and teach so that I could then be in front of a classroom of predominantly white institutions. We do need to talk about how our institutions of learning, our post-secondary institutions, are still based on very much so colonial structures. How we are still not in positions of celebrating and supporting our racialized Black faculty, staff, and students. And we need to get to that point where we recognize that we are working in white supremacist organizations. And this language is hard, but in order to lead from a race conscious lens, we need to examine what are our contributions to white supremacy. What are our contributions to enforcing colonial structures? So I leave you to hopefully think about that, and we can talk more about that as we move through. Again, putting myself in positions where I could elevate people of African descent, Black people, or people who experience other forms of marginalization. I worked in the Godicon Street area and at the George Dixon Center, Needham Center. I worked for the Afrocentric Learning Institute. The Community YMCA is one of the first Black female general managers. The Chocolate Community Center, and then at Dalhousie. But in all of these jobs that I was navigating and moving through, I moved into them, encouraging my staff to lead from a race-conscious perspective, to acknowledge the identity of the persons that we were working with in order to better serve those populations. Having the opportunity to immerse myself in different employments with people who looked like me was something that helped me to be able to exist in this very institution. And I know often folks talk about and think about, well, what about reverse discrimination? What about racism against other populations because we're elevating the experience of people of African descent and Indigenous people? What people don't want to talk about is the normalization of whiteness. How everything, particularly we live in North America, in Canada, in Nova Scotia, is based on a Eurocentric lens. From our education, to the articles we review, to often the research we do, to the people who are teaching us. So being able to have time where you are seen, where you are celebrated, enhanced the experience of students. To the point that we began to develop programs in this institution. And I applaud the Mount for some of the programs that they have also supported and piloted. So in my position at the Afrocentric Learning Institute, Mount St. Vincent University has led adult programs in Afrocentric leadership in the master's program, where they would have students that were all of African descent doing their masters, so they could then elevate themselves in the education program as administrators. So we do see some universities seeing the importance of cohorts, of focused programs for Indigenous and Black students, and leading from a race-conscious perspective. implementing these programs have changed the diversity of some of our institutions, has created a sense of welcoming and belonging for students, faculty, and staff who normally didn't have access to these programs in our institutions. So this, what you're seeing here is promoting leadership for African Nova Scotians in health, where we're making a commitment to change the face of healthcare in medicine, dentistry in our 9 schools. That's not easy. That's not to say it's not being done without its challenges. We still have curriculum that doesn't speak to diverse populations. We still have professors and administrators who fight against these programs, who are not leading from a race-conscious lens. We have a similar program in our science, in Matep Legacy. We're trying to increase our number of science, technology, engineering, and math students. We still are not seeing as many scientists of African descent. We need to think about COVID-19 and the Black Lives Matter movement. And I was ever so excited when they were showing the different folks who were behind discovering the COVID vaccine. And many of the folks that were involved as scientists were racialized and people of African descent. But that is not images that students get to see on a regular basis. So if you don't see yourself reflected as a scientist, as a professor, as an engineer, as a doctor, as a teacher, you begin to think that you can't achieve those professions. So not only do we need to lead from a race-conscious lens, we need to implement programs, access, services from a race-conscious lens. Think about who's missing in our research, in our grant capture, in our guest speakers. And so we recognize that it is a challenge in developing a race-conscious lens and race-conscious leaders. Because as we develop race-conscious leaders, then people begin to worry about job security. People begin to worry about, where am I going to fit as I develop a race-conscious institution, or as I become more aware of my contribution, perhaps, to racism, sexism, discrimination, homophobia, you name it. We need to commit ourselves in our teaching, in our leading. And I'm not saying, wave this flag and say, hey, you're not being race conscious. We need to lead by example in the spaces we're in and the conversations we have. In the language we may hear, we need to be willing to correct inappropriate languages that we're hearing from our peers and our colleagues. Not all of us are comfortable in doing that. I'm going to now share a little bit of research that we have done at different levels, and I'm thankful for my colleagues that I work with, Jessie Lee McIsaac, or the Early Childhood Collaborative Lab at Mount St. Vincent University. And so we have been able to even do research with looking at early childhood educators. And so what I'm showing you here on this slide, because as a professor and as an academic, we draw on our research to say, this is real, this is happening. This isn't me telling you this lived experience as a Black woman, but it's also founded in research that we have been facilitating. And so we had the opportunity under Jessie Lee McIsaac's leadership to talk to Black families who had children in early childhood education. So they were just babes, not yet in our public school system. And we talked to parents about their experiences of having their children in daycares. And some of the experiences were in predominantly, one was in a predominantly Black daycare center, but that wasn't always the experience. And so I just put up 2 quotes here. And it says, my mom tells me stories of teachers actually mentioning my hair being too big, or how to put it in braids, or children making fun. I was called the N-word. Unfortunately, I feel my children are probably going to go through the same thing. So this parent was talking about how their child would sometimes experience some of these challenges in daycare. One story was a mom talked about how a daycare teacher told her that her child had a good day at daycare today because kids played in his hair all day. That was her way of saying your child was included, because kids played in his hair all day. We had another situation where a daycare teacher talked about how she was mixed and she used to straighten her hair. And then a little child came in that resembled her as a child, and the little girl had curly, beautiful hair. And so the daycare teacher made a conscious decision not to straighten her hair one day. She came with her curly hair. And the little girl looked at the daycare teacher and said, "You look like my mommy." That completely changed that daycare teacher's experience and that child's experience, because now she saw somebody who looked like her, and somebody who looked like her saw her. Another example across different systems dealing with race and racism. One parent talked about, I remember one of the nurses, she said, colored babies, they have the Mongolian spot. And I was always taken back because she said colored. I often use critical race theory as a lens and Black feminist thought as a lens. And within critical race theory, we often will, one of the tenets is color blindness. But we're learning more about not using language that's also language that's found in the disability lens. And so we've moved towards color evasiveness. And so in this case, this mother was experiencing color evasiveness because people who are Black, who are of African descent, do not like being called colored. That was a derogatory term that was often applied to Black women who worked in service as domestic workers. And they were called colored girls or colored boy. And it's interesting working in health professions, and when some of my students are working with folks who have dementia and they're Black students, and their client or their patient often calls them colored, they often had asked me, how do they respond? And I say, you correct them. You correct them. So also teaching our students that it's okay to elevate the race consciousness of the clients you're working with. On another end, working with students who are in medicine. And no matter what program and what positions we may have as people of African descent, the assumption is that we got these positions because of our color, because we're Black, not because of our skills. This is also passed on to our students. And so doing a research project on students of African descent or Black students and their experience in medicine, dentistry in our 9 schools, they talked about the double imposter syndrome. And this quote is from a student in med school. And she says, even when I got in med school, I still struggled with confidence against, like, I was afraid to raise my hand and speak up in class, ask questions, afraid that I wouldn't sound articulate or smart enough when I talked, or that they catch on. They'd be like, oh, why is she even here? Is she the diversity admission? Those types of things would cross my mind. This quote is important because this student is moving through their med school as a Black student and knows that most people are looking at her from a race conscious lens, but in a negative way. So we know that a race conscious lens can also be not seen in a positive way when we just generalize Black people, Indigenous people. And so this student was grappling with who she was as a Black student. How do we support this as academics? How do we support this student as professors? We need to teach more from a race conscious lens. We need to encourage in a positive way people to understand why that's important as professors, as teachers. I will skip through this and talk a little bit about teaching while Black and the challenge of being that professor, and would welcome more conversation as administrator. And I'm sure some of my colleagues who are on this call are of African descent or Black and also teaching. We often have to do more than what is expected of our other colleagues who are not Black. I remember helping as we look at tenure and promotion files, and often SRIs of our Black, racialized, Indigenous, and queer faculty have been used as hate literature by students. We're often challenged in how we present research and papers that are trying to help students become critical thinkers. But as soon as we start talking about queer issues, Black issues, disability issues, Indigenous issues, then people see that as us being on a soapbox and evaluate us differently as Black, queer, Indigenous faculty. That needs to be recognized at our institutions. And how is that treated and evaluated when it comes for tenure and promotion? So we don't only need to educate our colleagues and our peers about leading from a race-conscious lens, but we need to make sure our administrators understand from a race-conscious lens how sometimes populations are impacted. A lovely colleague and friend who I miss dearly being at Dalhousie University was Dr. Arig Sababa. She has done, and I will share this with the organizers of this conference or of our talk today, getting institutions to lead from a race-conscious lens. And she did a paper or a report for University Canada. And that report actually provides a step-by-step guide of how organizations can become race-conscious. And I would encourage those who don't know this guide to read it. When I was reading it, I was absolutely excited to see how we could incorporate some of what is being said in this institution and in the work that I do as the Assistant Vice Provost, but as an academic and as a leader. And so I put a piece of it up here from this report. And it says, developing a race-conscious organization. And so looking at it from an EDI change paradigm. And I am very conscious of how we have a number of positions at many universities with an EDIA focus or focus. And in reading some of the materials that I was reading for another presentation I gave yesterday, as we begin to continue to diversify administrations at this institution, I was angered. I was angry because the work I was reading talked about how many people of diverse, racialized, and differing identities are in positions of EDIA, which has developed since the Black Lives Matter movement across Canada and even, North America. And how sometimes these positions are tokenism. How they're not given decision-making power. How they're given agendas that are expected to do so much, but then are able to do nothing. Because they're often understaffed, under-resourced. And as I was reading this material to prepare for a presentation yesterday, I was troubled. I was troubled because I wondered, is the institution that I am working at, that I've given 20 years to, now using me in a tokenized position where I can't have the impact that I want to have, where I can't make the difference that I want to make? It made me wonder, am I better as an administrator or as a professor full-time, where I can make sure and really push a race-conscious leadership agenda? I don't have the answer to that question yet, because this is still new in some of the readings that I've been doing. But going back to this report that was written by Arik for University Canada. So monocultural, complacent, or compliant, superficial focus on diversity. Homogenous, little diversity, no demographic data collection, tolerant, sensitivity, diversity, what's the language that we're hearing, diversity being symbolic, ritual signaling, mainly events to celebrate diversity. Leaders have little or no EDI, literacy, agency, or allyship. Moving into a multicultural, intercultural, color evasive, focus on inclusion. That word, inclusion. Everyone's welcome, and still be very superficial. Some diversity apparent, gaps in stratification and representation, a little bit of commitment to data collection and reporting, respect, acceptance, that's the inclusion, the language that we're now hearing, inclusion, some ethno-relativity, EDI is an add-on, additive, primary, individual, intervention, personal. Leaders have some EDI literacy or fluency, but little or no agency and allyship. We want to be able to move to an anti-racist consciousness, where diversity is at all levels and there's broad representation, or there's robust disaggregated data and intersectional data that's collected, and we're doing something with that data. We're leading from a race-conscious lens, where we use words like safety and humility and anti-oppression, and we mean it. We're doing some ethno-relative and transformative changes, where EDI is integrated in everything we do. It's individual and systemic interventions. We look at our structures, our policies. We're beginning to really move to a race-conscious organization, where leaders have an EDI fluency and proficiency and exercise agency and allyship. Either get out of the way or work with you to change the way our institutions are looking. That's where we want to get to. We want all our institutions, particularly our post-secondary institutions, to lead from a race-conscious lens. And so when I think about my teaching and not having the opportunities to impact the way I would like, because we don't have the diversity that we want to have at some of our institutions. So I've been able to develop with my colleague, Michelle Patrick, a course called Centering Black Health. The course is open to any students, but the focus is on looking at the lived experience of Black people in relation to health. We've now been able to offer that course for 2 years. Students have said it's the first time in their history of their education they have been the dominant group in their class. It has changed the way they interact in the class. It has changed the way they feel in a class. And it's changed the way that non-Black students feel in a class. And last year I had a student who identified as white. And students were talking about current events. They just had to go in the newspaper, grab an article that came from a race lens that talked about Black people, whatever article they wanted. Many of the articles that they bought in from current events or current affairs were negative towards Black people. The white students sat there as students were talking about how the news was affecting them in different ways, the stories they were reading. And she started to cry. And as she was crying, she said, "Do not save me. These aren't white fragility tears. These are tears because I don't have to have this experience on a daily basis." And in hearing the students talk, I realize how privileged I am as a white student. Can you imagine if more white students had that experience at our institutions, what that would be like? I applauded that student for recognizing the pain, the daily pain of the Black students who are willing to share in that class their trauma. It would be great if we create more spaces like that. And even if we didn't create spaces like that, but if we led from a race-conscious leadership lens. So going quickly through, because I do want to have time for conversation, just showing images of spaces that we're able to teach. And when you look at that image, this is within our recreational leadership program where we take students away for the weekend to develop a community of scholars. I applaud the law school program and the Indigenous, Black, and Mi'kmaq program that take their students, all years, their Black and Indigenous students away for the weekend as a chance of reprieve. And again, people may see that as a form of segregation as opposed to a form of protection. So what are our next steps? I encourage those who are on this call, and you might have seen this before, to ask where you are in leading from a race conscious lens, where you are in becoming an anti-racist, and acknowledging that we all are somewhere on this continuum of the fear zone, the learning zone, or the growth zone. And again, you'll have these slides. So this is also from one of our scholars, Ibrahim, in research, and he has a book on becoming anti-racist. And so are you in a position where you deny racism as a problem? Do you strive to be comfortable, to not advocate, to not be a disruptor? Are you in a space in the learning zone where you understand your own privilege and ignoring racism? Are you vulnerable about your own biases and knowledge gaps? Do you listen to others who think and look differently than you? Are you in the growth zone, where you speak out when you see racism in action? Do you promote and advocate for policies and leaders that are anti-racist? Do you yield positions of power to those otherwise marginalized? This helps to lead us to a race-conscious lens as leaders. This is one of my slides that I love. Well, this is one of the years where all medical doctors doing amazing work, and you would have seen that slide earlier. This is the strength of leading from a race-conscious lens, of acknowledging the institutional and systemic racism that have kept people out from being amazing. I make no apology for the pathway programs that we are developing in different institutions to support students who have experienced racism, discrimination, structural and institutional and systemic, from stopping them from becoming doctors. This was the largest graduating class in 2016, I believe, that Dalhousie had in med school. It was 6 of them. We now have 17 in our med school class. When we begin to change the way our programs look, professors, administrators worry, how are other students going to feel? What if we take too many seats by having these equitable admission policies? You heard my alarm. We need to be more aware of the message we're sending. That means not everyone is ready to lead from a race-conscious perspective. And so one thing I lead us with as we think about how we can become better leaders from a race-conscious perspective is that there's no such thing as a single issue struggle, because we do not live single issue lives. As an African Nova Scotian, as a Canadian, as a person who embraces, but did not always embrace, being a person of African descent. And thank you for spending this hour with us, or with me, and look forward to a rich conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Barb. That was really amazing. And if anyone has questions, comments, I'll just ask you to raise your hand and I'll be able to just allow your mic, and then you can say what you're going to say. Or also put stuff in the chat as well. Yeah, Jackie.
Thanks very much, Barb. That was amazing. I wanted to ask you this question, and I know you've covered some of this in your talk, and you can't get into everything in a very short period of time. But the push for equity, diversity, inclusion, and accessibility is sort of the overlay that most institutions in Canada, and I would argue elsewhere in the world, are sort of being challenged with. And so, can you talk a little bit about how you kind of do a little bit of sense making between race conscious leadership versus diversity conscious leadership, right? Mm-hmm. So in the EDIA and equity, diversity, inclusion, accessibility, the focus is not specifically on race conscious leadership, it's on diversity conscious leadership. And so how do you do this, the EDIA work that we're all leaning into, in order to make sustainable system level change, moving beyond what you've talked about in terms of tokenism? So how do we do this? We're tasked with EDIA largely, as opposed to race-conscious leadership. So difference between race-conscious leadership and diversity-conscious leadership.
I think that's a really great question, Jackie. And again, I consider myself that disruptor. And I find that we hide behind EDIA, the same way we hide behind multiculturalism. So I'll often challenge us to name what we mean by EDIA. So if we're talking about advancing opportunities for Indigenous people, let's say that. If we're talking about advancing opportunities for Black people, let's say that. If we're looking at the impact of homophobia, then let's say that. And so I encourage people who are in EDIA positions to name where the focuses are and stop hiding behind this lens called EDIA. And we're being mandated, and we shouldn't have to be mandated, to do a better job of making our institutions accessible. That's part of the EDIA. There's a law that's come down. Our institutions have a responsibility to uphold TRC. That falls again under EDIA. We have elevated positions because of Black Lives Matter. So I think we hide behind the lens EDIA, but when we're talking as AVPs, EDIA, or whatever people's titles are, I name that I'm fighting against isms, that I'm here to support diversity and inclusion, but the reality is that we are still living in a very race-conscious, homophobic, able-bodied society. Now, if we're not going to call out that that's why our positions exist, then we shouldn't be in those positions. And so that's why I have to ask myself, is it administration that's for me, or is it being a professor? Because I need to be in a position where I'm able to advocate for change, where I'm not just giving lip service, where I'm just not saying, oh, isn't this lovely? We have a policy. I need those policies to be enacted upon to advocate for real change. So I may not have answered your question, but I think we hide behind what we mean when we say EDIA, and we need to name it. And the institutions need to elevate that consciousness and stand behind people who are advocating for that kind of change. Otherwise, we're doing a disservice to those positions and to what we intend to have as change.
That's great. That's fantastic, Barb. Thank you so much.
I know that the passion comes out. I'm working on that.
No, that's great. Joelle, yeah, you should be able to unmute there.
I can, thanks. Hey, Barb.
Hi, Joelle. Nice to see you.
Loved your talk. Thanks for calling us all out on what we need to be doing, especially as administrators. And I understand your dilemma in terms of basically, and usually what I call it is, do you want to be an activist or a policymaker? But you can rarely be both.
Right.
So we need the troublemakers, and I'm very thankful for the troublemakers as an administrator because it helps me push along things. But have you been able to integrate the two successfully in any of the roles that you've taken? Because I find that for students, especially as you get passionate, whether it's a personal experience or a loved one, you get passionate and you want to call out, and then you're rarely invited into the room. Then when you push too hard, you're very rarely invited into the room to make those policies and to enact them. So do you have any advice for students, especially?
I love that. That's a great,
trying to do that.
Yeah, that's a great question. And even within this position that I sit in, both as an administrator and as a professor, I remind people that Dalhousie is over 200 years. And so we have 200 years of systemic racism and colonization and white supremacy to fight against. And so and that's why I said I think sometimes these positions are set up to not be successful, because how are you going to change in 2 years, 200 plus years of institutional systemic racism? And so I would like to think, and I think for me, it's been evident in some of the student successes, that some of the changes and some of the policies that I've been able to get behind and watch has made that change. Has it made the change as fast as I would like to see it made? No. But the fact that I'm able to see 24 or more Black students in medicine, whereas before you'd see one or none, tells me there's change. The fact that I was the first, and again, I applaud my friend and colleague, Jackie Cahagan, for being the first African Nova Scotian to graduate with a PhD in 2016. That wasn't 2010. In 2016, the institution's over 200 years. And there's other Black Nova Scotians who have PhDs, Dr. Wanda Thomas Bernard, Dr. George Elliott Clark, who applied for Dal and didn't get in to do his PhD. The list goes on. None came to Dalhousie because of the racism that exists, or they had, other opportunities. But now seeing colleagues who are that historical 8 generations African Nova Scotian doing their PhDs, teaching at our institutions, and then making changes because they're there. So I know the change is going to be slow, but I'm beginning to see it. And I intend on, so I'm saying it here, to continue to push myself in positions where I can have more power and influence. And so the door cannot be closed. I recognize concrete ceilings. I recognize glass ceilings. But I also know that I can't stop because the shoulders that I stand on, who bled, were raped, were whipped, in order to that I could even get an education. So I can't give up, despite the battles. Balance. Oh.
Mic drop. Thank you. We have a comment here. Thank you, Dr. Hamilton-Hinch, for a deeply thoughtful and real presentation, and thank you for bringing concrete pieces and recommendations too. I have to run off to another meeting, but profound thanks for voicing what so many of us experience. Yeah, for sure. Susie.
And I will share the report from the University of Canada. If the Mount doesn't already have it, I'll make sure to email it right after our talk. But I'm sure you have it.
Love that.
But I think it should be shared to all administrators and professors.
Yeah, it's a great layout. Susie, did you want to go ahead? You should be able to unmute.
Oh, great. Thank you. Thank you, Barb Hamilton-Hinch. Great to see you. And I appreciated all the things you're saying. And just to pick up on one of the things that you said, which I really appreciated, was this idea of how most institutions, we've added offices or positions that are called EDIA. And there's so many new ones. And I just did a study on the 10 institutions, the public institutions in this province, post-secondary. And 7 out of 10 have some sort of AVP or director or something. Anyway, so it does show that there's an interest in this, but it still comes back to the question that are universities really ready to advance EDIA? And I see there's such a lot of backlash. I'm sure you all can recognize the backlash against decolonizing the academy. There's, book banning. I mean, there's so many negativities going around. And so for me, it's really like going beyond what we call the EDIA and recognizing that we're talking about something much deeper. That's looking at, the plurality of knowledge, in deeper engagement of everybody on campus, not just students. So, yeah, I guess my question really is, how can we do this work when we often attribute the work to one person? And as you said, it's usually a racialized person, often within a structure that is predominantly white, particularly at the upper administration levels. And so how do we do this? And we're talking about so many things, the LGBTQI and mental health and well-being, the future of work, I guess the elephant in the room, which is about our mental health, those of us who are trying to do this work.
Right.
And those false claims that equity is just weakening everything, that we're, it's becoming worse because we're trying to do these initiatives. A lot in there. Sorry to ramble.
No. You're speaking of how we're feeling, Susie. So again, I also applaud you and thank you for the support you've provided. And I know you've been a big leader in the Afrocentric cohorts when we had them going to the Mount, and I applaud you for that. But I think it's getting folks to get out of the way or to join. And that's where we have to look at the normalization of whiteness, of white supremacy. And people need to acknowledge their contribution to maintaining white supremacy in our institutions. And people aren't willing to acknowledge their own contribution to that. Because in order to have real change, we need to have real resources. We need to have real support. And that's why we need to be aware of those of us in those positions when we are being used by an institution and not being able to make change. And sometimes, I mean, I walked away from a position because it didn't line up with my values and my beliefs, and I wasn't getting the support I needed. And it was, I have no problem naming it. It was at the community YMCA. And I found they were using the community Y as a way to support some of the programs in the South End Y, which was problematic. And they didn't celebrate same-sex relationships in the way that I wanted it to celebrate same-sex relationships. And the CEO at the time was not in favor of some of the changes I was making to support diversity and inclusion. And so I walked away. I couldn't work there. I left the Black student advising position at Dalhousie University to go into a limited term position where I would hope I would get a job, where I stayed limited term for 10 years. And I left the Black student advising position because somebody told me I could only advise Black students. And I was helping a student who was Indian, from India. So when someone tells me what my job is supposed to be, and I can't be that advocate or disruptor, then it's time for me to go. Because you know what you're getting in this person called Barb. And I am going to be that disruptor. I'm going to be that advocate. And if you know you're hiring me on those principles, then expect me to ask for the resources to be able to do that. Or keep me in my faculty position where I can apply for grants and funding and do the research I want to do and do the support I want to do. And I know there's limitations in there as well, but there's not as many. And I can create courses that can be like Centering Black Health. I can go into classrooms and disrupt and then leave. So I think we have to continue to advocate to have more colleagues. And I don't use the word ally because people use that word loosely, because you can't be an ally unless I told you you're an ally. And until people are willing to be advocates, work side by side with me, make sacrifices like I've had to make to really make real change happen, then we're going to continue to be providing lip service. So I don't know if I helped you or made it worse, but recognizing that we do need to take care of our own mental health and well-being, but we also need others who've had privileges and opportunities where they didn't have to stand in that way and take the shot.
Thanks, Barb.
Yeah, thank you. We are a bit over time. I don't know if people have to rush off. If not, that's okay. Or if anyone has a final comment or question. Barb, I love that quote. You know what you're getting in this person called Barb. That's awesome.
Thank you.
Yeah. Does anyone
like
else?
Even speaking to your point, even Susie today, like we need to make time for self-care. I'm the word for that. But today, after this talk, I was sharing with Jackie, Elizabeth, and Shanna, I'm going to Nordic Spa for the afternoon. And I have no apologies for doing that. But I need that minute of self-care so I can rejuvenate for tomorrow's fight. The other way I spend time to get rejuvenation is by spending time with sisters or like-minded people so that I don't feel isolated and alone in the battle. And it makes me realize the battle is still real. And I have some folks who are willing to make that walk with me. And I appreciate those individuals, both who are Black and those who are non-Black. So I even today, like this is important to me. So again, you know, as we end today, the fact that the Mount has organized this in the series tells me that there's a commitment there. And even though it may not feel like a big thing that you're doing, these talks didn't take place 3 years ago, let alone 10 years ago. People didn't want to have Black and Indigenous speakers speak about these important topics, these important issues, and make people uncomfortable. We stayed comfortable. We stayed not talking about real issues. So even those small steps to bringing real issues to this platform, and then using this platform however way we can, is making change. And I just have to believe that people who are listening to these conversations that you have began to have are thinking about, what can I do differently? What role did I play in contributing to whatever it is the discussion is about? And how can I do something to correct these wrongs? And I'm hoping that people are beginning to think through your talk. So I want to applaud the Mount for organizing these talks and for being a leader and a champion in so many ways. You were an institution that took girls before there was any place else for girls to go, and you celebrate that. So those changes are real, and we need to remember them.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. So Barb Hamilton-Hinch, thank you so much for an amazing talk. Thank you for being part of this discussion, and thank you for challenging many of our assumptions about how to do this work in a good way, and very grateful to you for that. The recording will be made available on the Black and Indigenous Speaker Series website. We will cut out the little, kind of preamble where we're just chit-chatting away. And then we'll have it posted for others to view this. And so you may get some people reaching out to you, Barb, so get ready for that. I know you're open to that. Thank you. And just lastly, this is an important speaker series. So if you have other Black and Indigenous scholars you'd like to hear from, please reach out to Liz in the research office, and we'd be happy to reach out to your suggested speakers. And again, thank you, Barb, very much for spending time with us today. And I hope you enjoy your afternoon, well-deserved afternoon.